Hi, everyone. My name is Luke Fontaine Richardson. I'm joined by Caden Lee and Brendan Carlson. We're members of Realize Radicalization, a student-led organization that aims to educate the public on radicalization and extremism. On today's episode of Get Real, our podcast where we interview a variety of experts in the field of radicalization and extremism, we are joined by Amarnath Amarasingam. Amarasingam is an assistant professor at the School of Religion at Queen's University, and he's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. He's an associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and an associate fellow at the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. He's the author of Pain, Pride and Politics, Sri Lankan Tamil Activism in Canada, and he was the co-editor of Sri Lanka, The Struggle for Peace in the Aftermath of War. Amarasingam is also an accomplished field researcher, having conducted extensive interviews with the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, as well as former and current members of the Tamil Tigers and foreign fighters, both current and former, in places such as Syria and Iraq, where he co-directed a study, Somalia and Israel and Palestine, among other places. Beyond that, he's also traveled across the globe presenting at conferences, written for prominent outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Atlantic. And he's been interviewed by the likes of CNN, BBC, PBS NewsHour, and the CBC. Amarasingam is particularly interested in terrorism and political violence, the sociology of religion, social movements, hate movements in the far right, as well as the politics of diasporas. We at Realize Radicalization are delighted to be speaking to today, and we're super thankful that you took the time to talk to us.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. Should be fun.
Okay, so the first question, I kind of want to start off really broad. So your work spans like a variety of topics. So when I was listing it, like you seem like you do everything. So what kind of led you to begin researching the topics of radicalization, extremism, and intervention?
So my first day of undergrad, and I always kind of start here because it was kind of a turning point in that my first day of undergrad was 9/11. And so I walked in, I walked in the university and someone had pulled up one of those old kind of tube televisions. I don't even know if you guys know what that is. And they pulled it right into the middle of the quad and everyone was kind of standing around it. And so I went home and then I turned on the news and I was like, oh, okay, so everything's different now. And so that's kind of what got me into studying at the undergrad level, history, political science, religious studies, sociology, that sort of thing. And then, so I graduated in 2006 and then went kind of immediately into my MA and PhD, where I looked at, and I think this is kind of the thread that connects all of these different things that you mentioned, is a kind of interest in transnational identity, right? And so I studied the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora in Canada, which is the largest Tamil community outside of Sri Lanka itself. And so that's, I'm from Sri Lanka as well, from the Tamil community as well. And the war was ending in 2009. And I noticed kind of different kinds of activism happening in Canada from what was very different from before. Because before it was kind of lobbying, fundraising for the Tamil Tigers back home. It was always kind of back home focused. And so with 2009 and the war ending, there was a kind of different dynamic that was happening within the community. So it was they started advocating at Geneva and the UN, and the conversation was changing. And so I wanted to kind of capture what that looked like for my PhD. And so that's my first book in terms of Pain, Pride and Politics, Sri Lankan Tamil Activism in Canada. Just as I was defending the PhD, I got roped into a few different government grants looking at the foreign fighter issue. And so I was kind of interestingly placed in that I knew all the social movement literature, I knew all the transnationalism literature. I knew that people in one country are going to be pissed off about things that happen in other countries. And so what happened with the Syrian Revolution is, so the Syrian Revolution starts in March 2011, becomes kind of brutal very quickly. And then you have the rise of several kind of jihadist groups and other rebel groups domestically. And late 2012, I want to say, people started leaving. right? People from Canada started leaving. Initially, we knew about it from a few guys that left in Calgary. So Damien Claremont, who was a kind of white convert to Islam, and some of his close friends like Salman Ashrafi. And so the media splash around those guys, that, the idea that a bunch of Canadians who were born here would get on a plane to go fight in a foreign conflict, became an immediate kind of policy concern. And so I basically started a kind of 6-year postdoc at the University of Waterloo, and I co-directed the study on foreign fighters, looking at that issue. And then I got hired at Queen's. And so what was unique about the Foreign Fighter Project, in terms from a research perspective anyway, was that a lot of these guys that left, they weren't like the ones obviously who left, for Afghanistan or Bosnia, Chechnya, etc. They were young, they were usually born in the West, they were social media savvy. And so they would land in Syria, they would land in Iraq, and keep their social media profiles active, right? So they would be tweeting about their breakfasts and tweeting about the frontline battle zone and things like that, and what they were doing on a daily basis. They were posting about it on Facebook, on Tumblr. I don't even know if Tumblr is still a thing, but Tumblr. And so a kind of unique research opportunity arose where you couldn't really go into the war zone per se to do research, and so, but you could, slide into their DMs and talk to them, right? And so I started messaging fighters, Canadians, Americans, anyone who'd talk to me, basically, and to get kind of life history kinds of interviews. So why did you go? Your upbringing. That sort of thing. And so that carried on for 6 years. That brought about kind of interviews with family members of people who had left, friends from people of people who had left, including a lot of kind of interviews in Europe and the Middle East where guys had gone to fight and came back. So that's kind of what I was doing from 2013 to 2019. And then I got hired at Queen's and been kind of continuing on different projects since then.
Okay, sweet. I mean, you've done so much. So I guess it's kind of hard to figure out like where to jump to next. But I'm curious, like when you were discussing and you were able to talk to foreign fighters, like did you notice any commonalities of why people joined and even why they left?
I mean, that's a tricky question because I think there's kind of different pull factors and push factors, I would say, right? And so when it comes to push factors, everyone came at it very differently, right? So the Calgary guys I mentioned, one of the Damien Claremont, white convert to Islam, high school dropout for a time, had diagnosed with manic depression, was homeless for a time, and so he leaves with his good friend Salman Ashrafi, who is born Muslim, is married with a child, has a $100,000 paying job at Talisman Energy in Calgary, university educated. So they come from very different backgrounds, but they leave at the same time. They're good friends and so on, right? So the push factors are, and I think all the studies on radicalization kind of show this. It's kind of individualized. It's individual to the person, and which makes it very difficult. Aside from saying that it's complex and diverse, to actually get any real trajectory of an individual person. Having said that, so the pull factors I think are somewhat uniform, particularly when it came to Iraq and Syria. At least in the Canadian landscape, we saw kind of different waves of people leave. And so 2012, 2013, I would say there are a lot of people who left who were very much focused on kind of the Assad regime in Syria, the violence that was happening in Syria, wanting to do something about it. 500,000 dead, 10 million refugees, and they felt like they couldn't just stay at home and post on Facebook, that they had to get up and do something individually. And a lot of these guys, they were focused, I think, on very localized concerns, so getting rid of the Assad regime, and then they'll likely come back home and go about their day. Starting in about late 2013 and especially into June 2014, when the so-called caliphate is declared, you had very different styles of people leave, right? You had people who were kind of much more ideologically Puritan, much more concerned with the caliphate, with the Islamic State, fighting for it, helping to sustain it, helping to grow it. And especially later on in 2018, I remember talking to guys and asking them about the Syrian Revolution, and they'd be like, "We don't care about the Syrian Revolution. We're here for the caliphate." And the difference in 2014 also was a lot of women and families started to get up and leave, which we'd never seen before. And so that was a unique kind of situation as well. And so I would say particularly for the second wave, the caliphate was huge. I mean, the kind of establishment of this so-called, kingdom of God on earth was in itself a kind of galvanizing moment for these guys, right? So the idea that you could live in a pure Islamic society, be yourself in kind of a complete sort of way, you won't be kind of tainted by Western identity, etc., was in itself hugely galvanizing for a lot of people that left in 2014, 2015, 2016. And so I would say the pull factors are, one or two reasons maybe that they wanted to go there, in addition to kind of their individualized reasons for wanting to go. But the push factors are all over the place. Socioeconomic background is all over the place. Education levels are all over the place. Religious background is all over the place. But I think all of them kind of wanted to be part of this, what they consider to be kind of a important historical moment.
Okay, so that's super interesting because I feel like a lot of times we tend to like paint things with such a broad stroke, especially like the push and pull factor kind of thing. Like obviously there's commonalities, but also ignore my dog in the background. So like kind of in your work with foreign fighters, so is there anything surprising that you learned that you had no idea before that you think people should know when they're researching foreign fighters?
I wouldn't say something I didn't know before, but I think what is a public assumption is that all of these guys are somehow like demonic, crazy, insane people who joined a death cult in Syria and are going to come back and kill you, right? And so I think that is a pretty common misconception. A lot of these guys that I talked to were fairly normal kids. They went there. I shouldn't say kids, like young men who went there with what they considered to be a kind of moral crusade, right? A moral cause. They were there for a particular reason, and so that I think was quite important for a lot of these guys. And I would say, I mean, the New York Times, the NYPD put out a report on radicalization where they say most of the cases that they're aware of are quote unquote extraordinary. These individuals are extraordinarily ordinary, right? And so these are everyday young people who feel like they have to kind of answer this call that they see is out there to actually do something. So that I think is a message that's important to be out there, because especially now that you're dealing with the returnee debates and the policy concerns around that. And I've been to Syria twice and interviewed a few of the Canadian prisoners there. Is that a lot of these guys are wanting to come back home, and Canada especially hasn't bothered to even lift a finger, right? And these camps are just kind of sitting there. These prisons are sitting there in northeastern Syria, and nothing's really happening from a policy side, partly because of this public perception that these guys are going to come back and like blow something up. And so that's kind of something you have to continuously contend with, I think.
Yeah, so within that, for the returning foreign fighters, they'd obviously have to go through some sort of de-radicalization or disengagement program. But how effective are these programs? Because we've seen instances in England where individuals who have gone through these programs in prisons have gotten out and then committed a ideologically motivated violent attack. So I guess for the public, how do we ensure that we make sure that we're running effective programs, or how do we even measure the effectiveness or the success of these programs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one, and I think partly part of it is a kind of unfair assumption I think that the public has about recidivism and what that looks like, because like it's not like we shut down all gang programs because there continue to be gangs. It's not like we close down all fire departments because there continue to be fires, right? And so I think there's a kind of heightened expectation when it comes to the CVE or de-radicalization space that's a bit unfair, I find, because it's almost like they'll have a program with 30 guys in it or 30 girls in it, and one person could commit a crime, and then everyone's like, oh, I guess we got to shut down that program. It's completely useless and pointless. And so it's a bit unfair, I think, in terms of the expectation that everyone who goes through these programs has to come out, some sort of perfect liberal Democrat or something. So I think in Canada we take an interesting approach because we generally don't focus on kind of what you're thinking, and so we often focus on kind of mobilization to violence and kind of pathways to mobilization of violence. And so in Canada we have what are known as kind of situation tables across Canada, usually linked to one or two police forces in a particular city. So Calgary has one, Edmonton has one, Toronto has one, Ottawa has one, Vancouver has one, etc. And so what they basically do is it's kind of like a triaging service. And so, let's say I'm a neighbor and I notice something. I notice that my neighbor's doing something strange, is kind of dabbling in extremist content. I may phone the cops, and the cops, if they decide that that somebody hasn't broken the law yet, might refer them to this kind of situation table where you can get some kind of early intervention to make sure you don't continuously follow down this path to eventually having to be arrested. And so we've started to do a bit of that in terms of the kind of pre-criminal space interventions, right? And so which I think which are generally pretty good, but I can see some of the criticism of them as well, because they're usually linked to law enforcement or funded by government, etc. And so there is that kind of pushback as well. But I think we have those kinds of programs, and so I think a lot of those NGOs will also be deployed again if the returnee issue is over. Like if Canada actually decides to bring our men, women, and children back from Syria, some of these groups, some of these NGOs will also be redeployed for that purpose, I'm assuming. And so we'll have to see. But in terms of kind of perfect success rate, that's never going to happen. I mean, you have even within the so-called Toronto 18, for example, all of them went through kind of prison counseling with imams and so on. One guy gets out, flies off to Syria, and is killed. Two guys get out. One of them goes to law school and graduates. The other is in grad school currently. And so I would, and then the two of them who didn't go to Syria actually praise, the imams that they met in prison, that the counseling that they went through in prison, and find that it had kind of enormous importance for how they changed their minds and so on. And so, is that program a failure because one guy went off to Syria? No. And so I think it's kind of largely individual. It's going to be a kind of hit and miss, like with anything, right? Any prison recidivism program, whether you're talking about other kinds of violent crime or whatever it is, you're going to have a rate of recidivism. That's just crime in general. It's kind of what the public perception of terror suspects are. That's unique, I think.
Yeah. So just going off of that general topic, obviously there are multiple pathways towards political extremism that many individuals take. But from your research, is there any set of common preventative measures that we could use to sort of tackle the diversity of pathways that these individuals may take?
Oh, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Yeah, not really. I think part of the challenge there is how you convince someone to go through these kinds of programs, right? And so it might be, if I commit a crime and no one's arrested me yet, it's very unlikely that I'm going to willingly go through some sort of de-radicalization. I think there are de-radicalization programs in other parts of the world that have shown some signs of success. Things like Exit Norway, for example, which was largely directed at the far right, is from 1997. It's quite old. Exit Sweden is 1998. We have Life After Hate in Canada, in the US. And so a lot of these groups have shown signs of success in kind of helping people leave, but it's usually individuals who are at least 1 foot out the door already, right? And so I think a lot of what our own research and what other research shows is that if you're kind of deep in the movement, nobody's really reaching you, right? It's going to be very difficult to convince you that you should somehow do something else. But if you're kind of 1 foot out the door, if you're kind of sick of the movement for whatever reason, just kind of battle fatigue, you want to start a family, PTSD, exhaustion, whatever it might be, then some of these organizations, having a former member of a particular group reach out to you to kind of counsel you out, have shown signs of success. But it does take some it does take some effort on the part of the person to want to leave and be on the way out before any of these kind of intervention programs actually do anything. So I think that's the challenge, is unless you've been arrested and the court kind of mandates you to go through some sort of program, you kind of have to wait for the individual to kind of come to the realization that they want to leave. And then there are programs and kind of organizations there to help, but until they come to that realization, it leads nowhere.
Okay, just to like pivot a little bit, but kind of on the same topic. So you've written like a lot about the Sri Lankan kind of efforts for, I guess you could call it reconciliation, that they've gone in the country, but I guess like other places too, they've had post-war reconstruction kind of reconciliation efforts and stuff. So do you think that like such efforts have been successful in any way in preventing future acts of political violence? And where do you see that happening in countries that are devastated by war? Do you think there's going to be a resurgence very soon in the countries that have been impacted by that, of extremist groups?
It largely depends on whether there's an effort to change kind of the structural situation, right? And so this is kind of kind of obvious in the Sri Lankan context, where before the civil war and after the civil war, kind of the legislative landscape, the treatment of minorities, the marginalization of minorities, both Muslims and Tamil in the country, has been kind of bred into the legal system, the law enforcement apparatus, and the courts and so on, right? And so the idea that you could just institute a reconciliation program at the surface level, and that is supposed to change the kind of structural dynamics of the country, has actually led to just more people being pissed off, right? And so, for example, there were, right after the end of the war in 2009, there were a lot of these efforts, conferences and programs put into place to kind of take a couple of members of the Tamil community, put them in a room with a couple of members from the Sinhalese community. Young people usually have them talk it out, have them become friends. Because there was this statistic that floated around that something like 60-70% of one ethnic group hasn't even met the other ethnic group, right? And on a small island like Sri Lanka, it's still quite segregated and quite divided by ethnic and religious groups, particularly if you're from the South. And so the effort was, okay, let's get everybody to meet each other, and that should, at least on an interpersonal level, do something. The challenge, of course, is that the problem was never kind of person to person. It was, you're structurally discriminating against, it's like the Jim Crow South, right? You're structurally discriminating against an entire group of people. Just because you're nice to me isn't going to change that. And so the reconciliation programs have often been surface level like that, in terms of let us all hold hands and be friends. But when I want to buy property, or when I deal with law enforcement or deal with the military, it's the distinctions are very much present, right? And so the former war zones in Sri Lanka were heavily militarized after the war. So you had something like 9 army camps for every, what was it, 3 army camps for every 9 people, or something like that, right? Don't quote me on that, but I think the level of militarization in the north was quite heavy, and so kind of trying to undo systemic barriers to access and education and things like that will continue to be a problem. Even today, I mean, even now, 2 months from now is the anniversary of the end of the war, and commemoration, remembrance, those kinds of things are still kind of clamped down in the country, right? And so if you kind of set up a memorial event or a commemorative event in the north in the former war zone, it'll be surrounded by military, it'll be infiltrated by kind of agents of the state, and so that's not what reconciliation looks like, right? And so I think that's kind of an ongoing challenge in places like Sri Lanka. What in countries that have shown some level of success, it's usually been much more structural changes, right? And so the kind of southern United States is a good example where there's still obviously a lot of work to do when it comes to law enforcement, but at least at the legislative level, you had Civil Rights Act, you had the Voting Rights Act, which changed the game, right, in terms of who had access and who could now have a voice in kind of mainstream politics. And so that's the kind of changes that have been shown to work and that have actually have long-term impact, not necessarily some of these more song and dance versions of reconciliation that tends to happen.
For sure. I think it's super interesting because like I don't really know as much about Sri Lanka as I'd like to, especially I feel like it doesn't really get as much media coverage now at all, really. So kind of on that topic, you talked about, I was reading one of your articles, what it means to desecuritize the Tamil diaspora. And I guess that could apply to a lot of other diaspora groups. Do you think, like, for those who don't know, can you explain what that means? And also, do you think if you took such a desecuritization approach, would it result in mitigating radicalization and stuff? Not saying that there's a particular problem with any group, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about there is the lens through which the community is often viewed, particularly since the 80s when we arrived. Like, so I came here in 1988 at the age of 6, and from then on, the community was often seen through a lens of national security, right? So in other words, our only real concern with this community from a government perspective is if they're troublesome, right, or troubled. And so we want to know who they're sending money to. We want to know what kind of mobilization they're after, and things like that. And so I think with the end of the war, there's still a kind of effort to say this is the kind of Tamil Tiger remnants of the community. So therefore, all of their activism, all of their mobilization, all of their concerns are still seen through kind of a prism of national security. And so what a lot of the members of the diaspora are arguing now is the LTT is gone, but the issues are still there. The post-war issues are still there. The structural issues are still there. There's still tens of thousands of people missing who the government hasn't accounted for. Land is being taken by the military. And so there's ongoing kind of problems in the former war zones. And so when the diaspora community who has, money and kind of financial stability and family back home want to speak about it or say anything about it, that's often painted through the lens, particularly from the Sri Lankan government, of, oh, that's kind of leftover Tamil Tiger rhetoric, right? And so there's a kind of clamping down on the social movement. There's a clamping down on what the social movement is allowed to talk about. And so a good example is a friend of mine runs the Tamil Guardian newspaper out of London, and Instagram has systematically kind of removed basic commemoration, basic remembrance posts that they have put up, right? So it could be something as simple as a child placing a flower next to her, father who's missing, and Instagram will take it down because he's probably a member of the LTT, right? And so basic things like that are kind of holdovers of this, holdovers of how the West treated the war to begin with, less of a kind of militant movement out for self-determination, but a terrorist movement, terrorist group that needed to be clamped down on, then the community became painted with that same brush, and so all activism became seen through the lens of the LTT or the Tamil Tigers, and so that's the kind of challenge I think for diaspora communities now. Are they allowed to talk about self-determination? Are they allowed to talk about an independent state? Are they allowed to talk about separatism, or is that immediately LTTized, right? So is there a kind of post-LTT Tamil nationalism, and what does that look like? And so that's the kind of debate that's happening in the community, and I think the public perception, particularly from the government, from the Sri Lankan government, is that it is these are the kind of they literally use the term LTT diaspora, right? And so, and they have, much like India does now, kind of an IT sector of people who are on the lookout for any sort of criticism of the government, and then they'll try to take down your account. They'll try to encourage the major platforms to take down posts that you're putting up, and so that's kind of happening in a lot of these social movements that we're seeing now. I mean, the farmers' protests in India is a good example. A lot of the farmers' protest content is being taken down by social media platforms because there's a kind of push from India BJP adjacent kind of activist circles who are just kind of out to take down that kind of content. So this is an ongoing challenge of like what kind of conversations are allowed to happen in the public sphere, and it's a kind of tangent from your question, but I mean it's how I think about that whole debate in terms of where the community is going and what we're allowed to say, and what particularly with social media now, like where we're allowed to say it, right? It's less and less happening on the streets, and more happening in kind of online spaces and transnational spaces like the UN or the Human Rights Council.
I find it super interesting to, like, recently, I guess the government's kind of catching up. Also, just ignore my dogs. I don't know what's happening to her, but it's interesting that we're so quick to securitize like diaspora groups, but then like more homegrown stuff has been kind of allowed to bloom in a sense. So do you think with this kind of like approach that people have had towards diaspora groups, do you think that in itself is going to create more extremism, their approach to it?
I haven't seen any evidence of radicalization from these kinds of communities on that level. I think the people who were radicalized before, who were fundraising before, are continuing to do some of that. That's true for the Tamil diaspora. That's true for the Sikh diaspora, and so on. But I think this kind of mass pushback hasn't necessarily happened. I think a lot of these communities are now, because the kind of second generation is now older, university educated, graduating from law school and med school and things like that. I think that the nature of the activism is now very, suit and tie, democratic discourse, Human Rights Council focused, right? And as opposed to taking to the streets, or as opposed to doing other kinds of fundraising, and so that's an important shift that's happening in a lot of these communities, that to kind of take the message to the international spaces and do it in the language that they understand, right? And so that's I think where much of this shift is happening. I mean, that's the whole point of my book on the Tamil community is that shift is quite important. So yeah, I do think people are more likely to kind of there's a huge kind of loss of focus on the violent aspects or the militant movement aspects, and really questioning what happens next.
So to shift away from the conversation regarding the Tamil diaspora, I kind of want to talk about conspiracy theories and conspiratorial narrative in driving extremism.
Yeah.
So how powerful are conspiratorial narratives in driving radicalization towards extremist violence? And is this purely a phenomenon that we see on the far right with regards to QAnon, et cetera? Or does it exist on the other side of the political spectrum? And within your research, have you noticed any of this within religiously motivated extremists, or let's say jihadists?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know a militant movement where conspiracy theory of some sort is not present, right? It usually makes an appearance in some form or another, either based on what they think Western governments are doing, or what they think the government that they're after is doing, what they think the Jewish community is doing, and so on. And so I think it kind of pops up anytime there's a very strong in-group, out-group dynamic. You're much more likely to kind of paint the out-group as not only someone we're against, but someone who's kind of cosmically sinister, right? And that is doing heinous things and is trying to hide it, and that sort of thing. And so what a lot of the studies show is these at a militant group level, there is a tendency to amplify and accelerate the trajectory towards violence, right? If the more you believe, not just that the people that the other is someone we just have a mild political disagreement with, but the more you start to believe that they are a sinister cabal of people who are doing something to your community, or to children, I guess, it has a tendency to kind of amplify and accelerate that trajectory towards violence. At the non-militant group level, it's difficult to know what that does in terms of violence, but what it has a whole host of other consequences. And so study after study shows, for example, that people who believe in conspiracy theories are less likely to vote, are less likely to vaccinate their kids, are less likely to trust the media, that sort of thing. And or that once they believe in one or two conspiracy theories, they're much more likely to believe in 5 or 6 more, right? And so that has huge consequences for kind of democratic discourse, and kind of public functioning of society in kind of a basic sense. And so I think it has consequences for non-militant communities like QAnon and so on. But especially now, pandemic vaccination rollout, you have hundreds of thousands of people who believe that the vaccine is filled with nanoparticles that are going to, do something to you, or that Bill Gates is running the whole show, et cetera. And so what does that mean for our safety and herd immunity in the long run, is a ongoing concern. At the militant level, I think, I've seen it with the Tigers, I've seen it with Al-Qaeda, I've seen it with ISIS. Basically, any militant group is going to have an element of some sort of sinister cabal or all-powerful outgroup that you're fighting against. And particularly, sometimes they largely have to do with kind of the masculinities and rape allegations and things like that you see all the time. American soldiers are raping our women, that sort of thing. You see that quite often in terms of what the kind of others are doing to us, right? And so if you look at Myanmar, if you look at the Uyghur community in China, there's always a kind of sinister motive attached to what these minority communities are doing to good and noble women on our side, right? And so we have to do something. And so I think when you paint that out groups as a kind of evil, it has to be painted in that sort of way to then say we have to stamp them out, right? And so. So that, I think anytime there's that kind of extremist rhetoric or polarization, you'll see conspiracy theories pop up in one form or another. All of them don't have to be kind of otherworldly lizard people oriented, but sometimes it's just as basic as our women are being raped en masse, or children are being killed, or whatever it might be. And so that it's designed to kind of mobilize, right? It's designed to mobilize very quickly and urgently.
So just continuing our discussion of conspiracy theories in general, where do you see the QAnon movement heading in the next few years?
That's the $1 million question. I think I mean, so there's a few things happening already. One is that, particularly post inauguration, you had a bunch of people kind of, and numbers are hard to come by, but I think, so I'll just use the scientific term of a bunch of people. A bunch of people got disillusioned and left, right? So they noticed they were kind of tired of waiting for this great plan. They were tired of waiting for something to happen, and they just kind of got disillusioned with continuous failure, which we've seen with other millenarian groups and apocalyptic groups as well. The second thing, I think, are the kind of diehard supporters who dug in their heels and are now waiting for March 4th, and who might wait for whatever the next date is after that. And so there's going to be a cohort who are just going to, much like apocalyptic groups, just kind of stick it out, right, and see what happens. The third concern I have is, especially when Parler or Parlay or however you say it was taken down, Gab went down for a little while, and you had people moving to Telegram. There was some chatter amongst kind of more hardcore far-right circles to kind of rope in this disaffected MAGA, disaffected QAnon types who were kind of searching for a home, and there was some chatter amongst the far right that, you know, maybe we can get these guys on our side. And so I think those three things are happening immediately. It's just a question of how long this goes on for. The other thing I would add is, I think the rise of QAnon is very much tied to the lockdown and quarantine and COVID. We saw a massive spike in March 2020, right as the lockdowns were coming in, because I think there were a whole host of conspiracies that popped up around COVID, and QAnon types were also echoing those conspiracy theories. And so QAnon almost kind of rode in on the back of the rise of COVID conspiracy theories and the popularity of COVID conspiracy theories, and so people kind of got tied into the QAnon movement by dabbling in COVID conspiracies. So then the question becomes, a year from now, once everything's, you know, presumably back to normal, people are back to work, kids are back to school, small businesses are thriving. You know, what is there still room for? Some of these kinds of views, right? And so I think you'll see a kind of, I don't know, not disappearance, but a decline in some of these groups, particularly QAnon. And so the challenge is, of course, even if they kind of leave the movement, that doesn't mean they're kind of not thinking along those lines. And so they're much more susceptible to the next conspiracy theory. They're much more susceptible to large-scale societal distrust. And so I think their behavior, even if they're not avidly QAnon, their behavior is still going to be impacted by having spent a year completely distrusting everything that you see, and how that kind of carries on into the next couple of years is going to be important to watch. I don't know if, you know, radicalization is the right framework for that. Probably not. I don't think the vast majority of QAnon types are radicalized in the way we think about it. I think QAnon has pushed certain people into radicalization and then violence, but the vast majority of people, you know, your 65-year-old grandma in a Q T-shirt who showed up on January 6th is not necessarily radicalized how we understand it, right? And so, I think, because it's a mass movement, it's not necessarily the right framework for understanding everybody.
Touching on a little bit too was that there's people being kind of driven to more extreme views because Telegram or something like that got shut down, so they're migrating to other things. They're trying to find other platforms to use. So, and they're kind of being exposed to these more far-right groups who hold more extreme views, and they're kind of casting like a wide net to try to catch these like less radical people, for lack of a better term. So do you think there's any way to kind of like mitigate that kind of effect? Like, because obviously you're saying that closing platforms doesn't actually really work, like Telegram. Do you think there's any other solution where these people can go without joining something like, say, a neo-Nazi group?
No, I mean, I think deplatforming from Parler and Gab was quite important, even if there is a fear of what might happen in Telegram. Because I mean, what it did initially was it kind of silenced the influencers, especially the QAnon influencers. Some of them had like hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube, and so they should have, been censored at least or taken down earlier. But I think a lot of social media companies didn't know what to do with QAnon because it technically is free speech and technically falls under, it doesn't really violate their terms of service per se, and so they didn't know what to do with it, and so they just left it alone, and it thrived. And so what the deplatforming did was it kind of cut down on some of that. But I think partly what I'm waiting for to see where, I mean, to Brennan's earlier question as well, is where Trump ends up. Because I think what platform he chooses, what megaphone he chooses, is going to be fundamentally important for where the kind of mass of people follow, right? And so if he ends up on Gab or something like that, they'll follow, I think. And so I'm kind of waiting to see where he ends up, because he's been quite surprisingly quiet, at least until last night, and at the CPAC convention. But I think, where he takes his megaphone is going to have a huge impact on which platform becomes the new kind of base, I guess, of activity for his following. But I do think a place like Parler or Gab, they're both kind of cesspools when it comes to kind of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, etc. But Telegram, for me, is a bit more crazy, right? There's like weapons manufacturing, and there's a different level of conversation happening on Telegram, which, and I've said this to the media before, is that I think a lot of run-of-the-mill MAGA types, run-of-the-mill Trump supporters will show up to Telegram and actually be a bit spooked by what they see. And so I don't know if it's going to be the home forever, right? And so there was actually a few groups that popped up on Telegram, like Parler Refugees or Parler Lifeboat, where it was supposed to be a home for some of these people who were leaving, a kind of safe space, I guess, for people who are leaving Parler. But I mean, to your broader question, I think the importance of that online community, and this was true when I wrote about it for ISIS, and it's true now, is massive, right? I think the level of camaraderie, brotherhood, sisterhood that they find with each other transnationally, it gives them a real sense of place and gives them a real sense of meaning and belonging and purpose, which sometimes many of these people don't have in their real life or their on the ground life. And so disrupting that once in a while is probably a good thing. But that kind of their online life is sometimes more important than what they have in the offline space. In the offline space, they could be nobodies, but in the online space, they have 150,000 followers and they're celebrities in the community. And so we don't want to downplay how important that is to some of these individuals, and how likely they are to continue the myth because they don't want to lose their place in that community, right? And so that's a other thing to keep in mind is these guys might start inventing, kick the can down the road just for the sake of having a platform. And because what are you going to do? When you're monetarily tied up in this, when you have a mass following, just say, I guess we were wrong, we're going home now. So they're now incentivized to kind of keep the myth going as much as possible as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's the exact same incentive that Trump has to continue the election was stolen myth as well, right? Politically, and now trying to sort of turn the Republican Party into becoming the party of denialism. But when you're speaking about Telegram, I have a bit of background through researching it last year. And the one thing I was really blown away when I started looking into QAnon after the January 6th riot was the similarity in the terminologies used on Telegram and on these QAnon threads, and also on another one called the Donald. And people are using terms like Zionist occupied government, and like you said, the anti-Semitism, the Islamophobia. And when I realized that these people would be migrating over to Telegram, that kind of made me feel a little worried, because essentially they've already had the introduction to a lot of the language used by these groups that are the extremely far right. Yeah. But I didn't notice that, of course, until after the riots, because my perspective of QAnon was, well, these are a couple of just conspiracy kooks. They're not that big of a deal. It's kind of more so an inside joke, maybe. I didn't really take it seriously until, of course, after January 6th. When did you really notice QAnon yourself, and when did you realize it was far bigger than what the majority of the public assumed it to be?
So I've been studying conspiracy theories for like 10 years, but I tried very hard to ignore QAnon, if that makes sense. I didn't want to know anything about it. I was hoping it would just go away. And then Trump's team started retweeting QAnon folks. And then Jessica Prim happened. Jessica Prim was this woman who went on this kind of long drive where she made a video about herself, saying she wanted to assassinate Joe Biden, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's when I thought, this is kind of, and there had been a few attacks before that, which didn't kind of rise to the rate to kind of my radar as big as it probably should have. But Jessica Prim was a big one. Before that, the Pizzagate one worried me a bit. Edgar Madison Welch kind of drove into the Comet Ping Pong and shot I think once and before being arrested. So what I started to realize is a conspiracy theory for the first time was actually mobilizing people to violence. I can't think of one other conspiracy theory that has actually mobilized somebody to violence. It's often within an already violent movement, but it's very rare for the conspiratorial ideology itself to actually mobilize somebody to violence in this way. And so you don't see kind of flat earthers going and shooting up museums or something like that, right? And so that's when I called Marc-Andre Argentino, who I think you guys have had on before, a good friend of mine, and I said, "Tell me everything to know about this thing." and so we decided writing. We started to write together a few pieces on kind of COVID conspiracies, QAnon conspiracies, partly because I realized it was going to have a much more public and political impact than I initially thought. And so, people like him had been following it much longer than I had. Travis View and others had been following it from day one. And so then I just started consuming that kind of content to learn as much as I could about what was going on, because like I said, I tried very hard to not pay attention to it in particular because I was hoping it would just go away. But the Trump megaphone and a lot of members of his team, I think Alex Kaplan from Media Matters said they've been retweeted like 300 times or something like that, right? So the Trump administration with his 80 million followers had continuously amplified this very fringe and ridiculous group to the point where everyone had to pay attention to it. And then it was on the debate stage, and it just became unnecessarily larger than it had to be, I think, because fundamentally it's insane, and it could have just been dismissed safely if it wasn't for the broader political context that kind of allowed it to blow up. So,
yeah, it kind of goes back to my earlier question too, when I asked about the conspiracy narrative within other movements, because I understand the jihadist aspect where you said, like, soldiers might be raping our women and killing our people, and it might be true or not necessarily true, but it's more believable. But with the QAnon stuff, it's just absolutely mind-boggling. Like, I don't know how anyone can I mean, I understand how they get into it, but still, it's just it's so beyond the reasonable person to engage with. But then what's crazier about it is that reasonable people, or formerly reasonable people, absolutely engage with it. And I mean, I never in my entire life would think that a U.S. president would never would actually not denounce this, right? So you have the Trump effect, which is huge. But anyway, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to throw it over to Aluk, who's going to provide the proper vote of thanks.
Great, thank you.
So yeah, we covered so much topics today. We talked about the Tamil Tigers, we talked about ISIS, we talked about far right, we talked specifically about QAnon. So I'm really appreciative that we got to cover such like a wide scope of topics. And I just want to thank you, Mr. Amarasingam, for taking the time, because we know how busy you all are. taking the time to talk to us. And we're just like a group of students, and it's super interesting for us to hear from you. And once again, we are super appreciative of it, and we hope to maybe chat again soon in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Anytime. I had a great time, and keep doing what you guys are doing. It's great.